Chay Bowes is a master in geopolitics. He hasn't just graduated in it, he has lived it. He's a political commentator of note. He's an Irishman in Moscow, and he is up first on tonight's Mother of All talk shows. Chay, always a great pleasure. I must say your output is growing in strength to strength. You're unmissable for events going on in the Russian theatre, and I think that it's to that theatre, especially with a ceasefire in Gaza, we're all now going to turn, because it's quite clear. I was interviewed by a Ukrainian journalist today that they believe that it's the end game, because Donald Trump means it when he says no more Mr. Nice Guy. Zelensky has not been invited to the inauguration. That must be pregnant with a great deal of meaning. It looks to me like we may be in the final months of the war. How does it look to you in Moscow?
Mm-hmm. Well, George, thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure. And again, thank you for your hard work and persisting despite all the threats to our free speech that you very aptly described. Well, here in Russia, I suppose a little context would be useful. As this war goes on, and the Russian economy and Russian life essentially stays very much the same. I was just having a conversation yesterday, actually, ahead of coming on, with a few younger Russians, asking them about how they perceived the war, how they perceived life here. And if anything, the war here is fading into the background of normality in a way. And in some way that informs how I think the Kremlin will engage with any peace discussions. The context here is the Russian army is advancing. Toretsk, surrounding Pokrovsk, everyday settlements, dozens of kilometers, forward advances. The Ukrainians only now control, a fraction of what they controlled in Kursk. They're losing a huge amount of men and material there as well. So Russia's winning the war in a military sense, absolutely so. Little pinprick attacks from the Ukrainians on an oil depot here there. Russia's a continental landmass. These type of attacks have no impact whatsoever on the outcome. Everybody knows what the outcome is. I think the Ukrainians, the Americans, the only ones don't seem to accept it is your friends up the road in Whitehall there, George. But I think there is a sense now, though, with Trump coming. And this is also very interesting. Your poll saying 50-50. What do people think of Trump? Well, my perception of Trump is I don't really care about his politics. I don't care about his past. I really don't care. I care about peace. I care about him and his new team challenging the forever war machine, which you and I have talked about so many times, this pernicious relationship between conflict and politics in the Atlanticist think tank fantasy. We've seen it in Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. We've seen these wars that, remember, they said they were going to stand with Afghanistan as long as it took. And it took, a long time, decades. It took trillions of dollars, but they left overnight. That's what happened in Afghanistan. So I think there's a real dawning of reality now in Europe as well, which looks like it's going to face bankrolling Zelensky's jaunt alone now. So in Russia, there's a sense of enthusiasm, if you like, optimism around Trump. Everybody here knows what Donald Trump is, what sort of politician he is. But the fact that he's not as bought into the think tank fantasy, as I say, this echo chamber of these sort of closed circles of advisors, people like Jeffrey Sachs, people like you, people like Glenn Deese, and all the professionals who could have helped, John Mearsheimer, these greats, Professor Stephen Cohen, all these great people that could have advised them exactly what was going to happen in Ukraine are all kept outside. And these gratifying people are all brought in. So the reality is dawning now with Trump as a disruptor. And disruption can be a good thing when it comes to conflict and war. I think he wants to look after America, make America great again. To do that, you're going to have to stop hundreds of billions of dollars being flushed into one of the most corrupt dictatorships on earth right now. And that's what Ukraine has become. I've said it for years. It is a dictatorship. It's a a singularly governed state. And it has to end. The people in Ukraine know it. They're terrified. They're living in a police state. They're being dragged from the streets. I try to publicize that as much as I can. My colleague that you spoke to earlier as well, there's a terrible reality dawned in Ukraine now that this is only going to go one way. So there's a sense of hope. There's a sense of realism. But there's also something that I would say to everybody listening from Russia here, from living and working among the Russians for years now. The Russians don't do drama. They don't move quickly. The Russians, I think it was Bismarck said, the Russians take a long time to saddle up, but when they do, they ride like hell. So the Russians have begun only really recently in terms of the conflict to really master the supply chains, to master the command, to innovate on the battlefield, and change the way they do warfare. And if there's anyone on earth that knows war, it's the Russians, as you know, as a man who studied the Soviet Union, understands it. The great sacrifice of the Russian people and the Soviet people. 27 million people died fighting Nazism, defeating it. This is a living part of our history here. People are already starting to talk about May 9th here in Russia. How will it be celebrated? Will it be a big celebration this year? Will Musk come to the May 9th parade here in Moscow? So there's a sense of measured optimism that something's going to change. And certainly that this black-eyed, shark-eyed delusion about Ukraine, the likes of Blinken and Biden, and this utterly inept cabal that he surrounded himself with. I mean, look at Palestine, look at the Middle East, and the delusion that they were working in the interests of peace at any stage is remarkable. Same here in Ukraine. Everybody knows there's a singular cause of the conflict here from 2014, the last phase of it, where a legitimate government, as imperfect as it was under Viktor Yanukovych, was overturned. It was overturned. Everybody knows that. Victoria Nuland, Jeff Pyatt, they overturned the government here. They appointed the government. She was recorded doing that by the Russian security services. So we know that I think the EU particularly are going to have to be dragged to the peace table. I think people like Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer will have to be dragged to the peace table. And there's only one man on earth that can drag the EU and Starmer to anything, and that's probably Donald Trump. So we live in hope, but the Russians will negotiate as they advance, and they're advancing. They're finessing their military. It's growing. People here are, I would dare say, as tragic as it is, so many people dying. In Ukraine, over 1 million people. People have given their lives here as well. It's a war. But dare I say it, the longer it goes on, the more confident people are that the victory is there. It takes time. Russians don't do anything in a hurry. They just don't do it. Their default is skepticism. So they're skeptical, but there's an undercurrent of hope and excitement with somebody who's, essentially, an innovator. Trump is an innovator. He wants to do the deal. And he's laid it out there. He said he's going to fix this. So the Russians are going to sit back and watch, but they're certainly not going to stop advancing. The war will continue. The advances will continue. And one final thing, which I think is very important. Anybody who thinks that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin will negotiate about territory like Kursk with Kiev, he's already said, we don't have anybody to negotiate with in Ukraine. There's no government there. The president is illegitimate. The parliament is illegitimate. So he said, look, we're not going to negotiate with these guys, but they're certainly never going to negotiate on the basis of territory. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So we live in hope, but it's a really, really exciting times. We're really looking forward to see how the big Don, as we call him over here, does on the next couple of days.
Well, let's detour into the rest of Europe for a minute before coming back to the battlefield. I have some thoughts I'd like to test your opinion on. But in the interview I did this afternoon with a Ukrainian journalist of note, it's clear that there is a class of person, not her, but there is a class of person who thinks that there can be life for the Zelensky regime after Trump, because people like Keir Starmer and one or two others continue to give wholehearted support. You will have seen the ludicrous, utterly Alice in Wonderland idea that Britain is going to give £3.6 billion per year for the next 100 years. Now, no parliament can bind its predecessor, no parliament can bind its successor, but that's going the extra mile. 100 years, we're going to give you 3.6 billion. Well, first of all, that will not last. It will not last even into the next parliament, never mind 100 years. But Keir Starmer can't support the Zelensky war effort on his own, can he?
Look, this is ludicrous. I mean, and the context in which Starmer has made this declaration. It's as if somebody said, look, give me an idea. Well, let's do a 100-year deal, because none of us would be around to see it fail. It's just ludicrous. Like you say, it's Alice in Wonderland stuff. But the context in which it's done is interesting. The day he came to Kiev, there was a report issued into the NHS where 5,000 nurses were interviewed about the catastrophic conditions in the NHS, people being found dead under coats, on trolleys and on benches, essentially third world levels of services for British people. The cuts to energy. When I met, let's say, or confronted the British ambassador here in Moscow, I asked him, I said, how can you promise, tens of billions of pounds to fund a war in Europe, in a country most of the people who live in your country would never have known existed if you hadn't anointed yourselves as the defenders of this dictatorship? How can you do that while cutting back on things like gas for pensioners? I mean, it's just brutal. And this idea of 100 years of support is just ludicrous. How about a 1-year plan to fix some of the problems that the UK is facing? How about an hour sitting with a pensioner to find out just how hard life is on the high street and in the estates of the UK? It's utterly delusional. So there's no way that Britain can fund this war in Ukraine. There's absolutely no way that Europe can fund the conflict in Ukraine. There's no way they can do it. And that's why Europe is so terrified right now. Ursula von der Leyen, Guy Verhofstadt, all these sort of pro-war libertarians, whatever that means, they are absolutely terrified that Donald Trump is going to say enough. And he's liable to do that. This is the wonderful and terrible thing about Donald Trump, is he's liable to just hold onto the tablecloth, stand up, and just pull the whole thing down onto the floor. And it's a remarkable reality we're facing, and it's this sense of insecurity that is moving people towards the peace table. It's not for a want of peace, because the scam in Ukraine is so fruitful for the elites there. They don't want to end it. The European Union doesn't want to end it, because, God forbid, they'd have to actually face some of the catastrophic effects of the self-harm sanctions that they've implemented, destroying the German economy, the beating heart of European industry destroyed. So, I mean, this is just absolute fantasy. But it's always been a fantasy. There was always going to be a day where they realized that the emperor actually has no claws. There was going to be a day, and I dare I say it, tomorrow is the beginning, the dawn of that day, where the child, that the people like us who were the children saying the emperor has he's no clothes on, dare I say it, the realization is going to land very soon that there's going to have to be peace, not for the want of peace and stability, but because of the fear of a catastrophic failure. The collapse of NATO, the collapse of the European Union itself, potentially, all for Ukraine, all for a country that isn't a member of the EU or a member of NATO. It's remarkable.
Amen to all that. It's not just that we've sacrificed our economies, and that, of course, we clearly have, sacrificed the living standards of the most vulnerable in our societies, that we clearly have. But we're now beginning to murder democracy itself in Europe. The brazen, blatant cheating of the people of Romania, for example, of their presidential choice, might not have been my choice, Chay, maybe not yours, but it was the Romanian people's choice. And he was cheated for one reason only, namely that he wanted to end the war in Ukraine, not allow Romania to be a base camp for it. And next month, we've got a poll in Germany, general election, where they're they're really beside themselves with fear as to what the outcome of that might be, and they might end up trying to cancel that one too.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I agree with you. Kalin Georgescu may not be our political choice. He may not align with a lot of things that you and I may agree on, although we disagree on some things. I've been very vocal in defending the right of the Romanian people to have their democratic will. It's this a la carte attitude to democracy, which we see now in the European Union. It's just, it's so poisonous. We've seen it as well in Moldova, by the way. All you need is an allegation of Russian interference. You need absolutely no evidence of it. Now, we saw the president, Salome Zurabashvili, in Georgia. I was in Georgia, witnessed these paid protests. I was on the streets watching this occur, talking to students who'd be given 20 euros each for every banner they would bring. I confronted the people holding the Russia, or Georgia is not Russia banner, and they turned out to be Italians, couldn't speak Georgian, had been flown in by an NGO to hold this banner in English in the middle of Georgia. So this idea that the Russians are interfering in the democratic process in Europe is ludicrous. Again, it's projection. It's like this million Russian soldiers who are dead. I mean, that's just absolutely laughed at here in Russia. It's a ludicrous idea, but it's projection. There are a million dead in Ukraine. The idea that it's Russian interference in Georgia, in Moldova, in Romania, and now in Germany is just remarkable. You're allowed to choose any leader you want in the European Union once it's their leader, once it aligns with their Atlanticist view, once it sort of agrees that you have to ignore things like the attack on the biggest piece of energy infrastructure in European history, the Nord Stream, a crime that the perpetrator and the victim neither want solved. It's quite remarkable. So, I mean, we're really beginning to see the veil slip now. And when Donald Trump is sort of advised and counseled by somebody like Musk, who seems to be quite awake when it comes to this type of stuff. He did a big spaces with the head of the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland. Again, not a party that I'd agree with on everything by any means, but I would defend their right to have their opinion once it's constitutional and democratic. Same with Kalin Georgescu in Romania. Same with the Shore Party in Moldova, who were attacked for being pro-Russian. No evidence. And it all stitches into this narrative of the bogeyman of Russia. And today, of course, we had the Washington Post admitting that the cables up in the Baltic weren't damaged by Russian submarines. They weren't attacked by the Russians. It was a trawler that did it. But that headline is at the bottom. The damage is done. The muck is thrown out there. People are so busy in the UK and Ireland and Germany trying to survive, find the money to pay for their kids' school lunches, trying to navigate inflation and the cost of living crisis, that everybody's heads are buried in that sort of reality. They don't get the chance to look at the headline twice. So the client media peddles this lunacy, but never rescinds it, says, oh, by the way, we were wrong. So it seems that the EU is again desperate now. So I think the EU wants Ukraine to go away. It wants it to go away. And in the halls of the EU, I know a couple of European MEPs. I know a couple of people who actually used to work advising NATO. And they say in the halls of NATO and in the halls of the EU, everybody agrees that Ukraine will never join either. Never in our lifetimes. It's a bit like the Keir Starmer 100-year promise. I'll get to you next week. I'll get you tomorrow. Tomorrow never comes. It's just insanity, because I always said the only plan the EU, NATO cabal had regarding Ukraine was escalation. And if the Russians stood up to them and said, okay, here's the line, and I think that line was demonstrated with the Oreshnik missile, which nobody knew Russia had, including the United States, an unstoppable delivery system. These are the guys, remember, who were fighting with shovels, stealing chips from washing machines. This was the economy that was in tatters, according to Ursula von der Leyen. Remember all that in the context of this. So I think the Oreshnik sort of demarcated enough is enough, okay? Incredible restraint has been shown by the Russians, but the Russians rely on sort of depth of the promise, that they actually can and will do things. They don't do what the EU does and the United States does and the British do, 100-year promises. They signed a strategic deal with Iran yesterday here in Moscow, which is a very important thing. The Syrian outcome, I think it hurt Russia and it hurt Iran. So they've both said, well, look, we now need to sort of copper fasten our ties to push forward, to re-exert our influence again. So these are the real things that are happening. Keir Starmer can promise that, every kid's going to get a chitty chitty bang bang life-size model in 100 years' time. No one's going to be around to challenge him. But in reality, what's going to happen very soon is the EU is going to have to realize that it doesn't have the money to fund what it's given to Ukraine. Forget about funding this catastrophic war. And it's a war that Ukraine is losing. They're losing it in manpower. They're losing it militarily. Politically, the war is lost. I mean, it's not even a democracy. The idea that Europe is defending a democracy is also ludicrous. It's not a democracy. Banning the church, banning the free media, disappearing people trafficking. The list is endless. And this list was accepted and acknowledged by people like the US State Department in a year before Russian troops were forced across the border in 2022. The US State Department declared Ukraine to be the most corrupt country in Europe. It was endemically corrupt in its judiciary.
People's memory is so short.
There's no surprises here.
That seems like a story from the last century that you're telling. Finally, Chay, and I'm grateful for your time. There will not be negotiations beginning tomorrow or next week or next month. The powwow between Trump and Putin may not even occur in the first month. But either way, the Russians are going to keep on advancing. We are looking, aren't we, at a situation where every day that goes by without a negotiated settlement means that there's less of Ukraine to negotiate about. And it's perfectly possible that we'll have what we used to call in the old days the Finlandization of Ukraine, namely that in Kiev there will be a friendly government to Russia, and all of the Russian-speaking territory, including Odessa, will actually have reverted back to Russia, in which case Western Ukraine will be a landlocked state. BlackRock and all the others can go whistle for whatever investment they think they've made in exploiting Ukrainian resources for the future. This is a thoroughgoing disaster for those who pushed this war, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the big topic of discussion. Russians love to talk about politics. The famous joke here is, look, I don't want to talk about politics, but, and 3 hours later, you're still talking with this guy you just met in a bar or on a bus, So everybody here wants to talk about politics. And the big issue is, Odessa. How do we link with Odessa? How do we get to our people in Transnistria, this sliver of Russian territory, essentially? There's Russian military there, Russian-speaking people there, which is borders, Western Ukraine and Moldova. So that's the big topic of discussion. In Russia, there's no doubt here at all that the war is already won. As you say, it's just a matter of time. I think personally that the EU knows that the Russians are advancing. They know, of course they know. They know everything. They know more than we do, maybe, with the surveillance they have. They know that the Russian army is advancing rapidly. But I don't think that's a problem to them, because it's less for them to have to fund the reconstruction of. And the Russians, remember, have recently taken the biggest lithium mine in Europe. They have in Pokrovsk, one of the biggest coal mines in Europe today. The Ukrainians, by the way, tried to burn the coal mine rather than leave it intact for the Russians. And of course, Pokrovsk is a Russian city, essentially. Odessa is a Russian city. Kharkov is essentially a Russian city. These are Russian cities, Russian speaking. And the tragedy of it all is, early on in the conflict, in the civil war began in 2014, which rejected this Western-installed coup government in Kiev in 2014, people were saying, look, we don't necessarily want to be part of the Russian Federation. We just want to be respected within Ukraine, in a federalized Ukraine. And to some extent, a lot of the recommendations of the Minsk Accords, which were accepted by Russia, by Ukraine, by France, Germany, Britain and America, will end up being accepted, but it will be Russia who will have the veto on all of the elements of it, because possession is 9/10 of the law, as you know, George. And day by day, Russia has more and more territory. And the other thing is, the military complex in Russia is very powerful. The army is very powerful. There's been a lot of sacrifices made. And any delusion in the West that the Russians are clamoring to do a deal with the West is utterly, utterly delusional. I can tell you from here on the ground, there is no urgency to do the wrong deal with the West. The idea that the West can be trusted even here is remarkable. Even President Putin has said it himself. Look, I should have probably intervened earlier. We tried, we believed our partners in the West, and that's very sincere. I think there's a sense here in Russia, once bitten, twice shy. The deal that's done will not be a deal that will mean the people who are fighting today's children will fight again. And that's a very important thing that people should remember in the West.